She's a seasoned executive. Katrina has over 2 decades of experience running both not-for-profit and corporate organizations in the technology and media sectors, as well as having experience in the public sector as well. She's a member of the DAMA and volunteers with several AI ethics organizations. She was named to the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics list. Katrina holds an undergrad in business administration from Simon Fraser University, a Master of Arts in Communications and Technology from the University of Alberta, and is an IAPP certified information privacy professional. Katrina developed Canada's first micro-credential in AI ethics in partnership with Athabasca University, and she's a member of the Calgary Police Services Technology Ethics Committee and recently has served as the City of Edmonton's Data Ethics Advisor. So without any further ado, Katrina, the stage is yours.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to come and speak at Devfest. This is going to be probably the least technical talk that you're going to get all evening, but I'm excited to be here with you to talk a little bit about ethics. Let me tell you a little bit about my story and how I got into this line of work. So it actually started here at the University of Alberta back in 2018. So I came back to do a master's degree, doing one of those midlife career pivots. And so I came back to do this master's degree, and I didn't know exactly what I was going to do my research on, but I wandered into this lecture that was being given by a prominent AI researcher, Dr. Jonathan Schaefer. And he was talking about AI gone wrong scenarios, all of these issues with AI causing all these problems. He was super concerned about all of this. And so I went up to him afterwards and I said, who is doing work on this problem? And he told me not enough people. And that's what really sparked my interest in this field. So I did some work on ethical principles and applied ethics. And then I graduated in 2020, wanted to keep going with this work. So I decided to launch my own company, Ethically Aligned AI, to help organizations to think about ethics and think about responsible AI. So that's a little bit about me and why I am here. So whenever we build a technology of any sort, doesn't matter if it's a digital technology or something like a ship or a plane or even inventing electricity, we get really focused on all the good things that our technology is going to bring about. It's going to do all these beneficial things in the world. But at the same time, we have this capacity for all of these other things to happen as well. And that's really the place that I inhabit. This idea of trying to mitigate what are the risks of this technology and how can we do better. So that's really what I think a lot about when I think about the impacts that AI is having on our world. So we can also think about the ways in which we shape our tools and our tools shape us. And we can think about you as designers, as researchers, as people who work in this field of AI, you get to make a lot of choices, a lot of design choices that are shaping the tools that people like myself use. But also, as Deva Priya was giving her talk, I was thinking about the tools that you use as well, and how those tools, like Monai, for example, shape the work that you do. So there's always this kind of symbiotic relationship going on between ourselves and our tools. And that's really the perspective that I'm going to be taking tonight when I talk about this topic of AI and ethics. All right, so with that in mind, I want to take you back to where it all began, 1956. This is the moment where a group of researchers went off to Dartmouth College and they basically came up with the idea of artificial intelligence. So this is the year when that term was first coined. So that was happening on the East Coast of the United States. But way over on the West Coast of the US, there was this other story going on that's really important to this moment as well. Because William Shockley was setting up Shockley Semiconductors. And that really was the birthplace of Silicon Valley, and the moment where the compute story started to take place. And that's really important to this AI moment that we're in right now as well. But there's a third thread to this story that has to do with the culture, what was going on in the culture at the time. And Isaac Asimov, who was already a popular science fiction writer, even back in the 1950s, he wrote this story called The Last Question. And in this story, there is this computer that people get to ask questions of. And it keeps coming up with this idea of insufficient data, can't answer this question until the very end. I'm not going to spoil a story for you if you decide to have a read of that. But it's this idea that we need data as part of this mix as well. And all of this is set against this bigger backdrop of the Cold War. So you can think about coming out of World War II, we've gone into this Cold War moment, and the military is super interested in everything that's going on. They're funding computing sciences, they're funding AI projects, they're involved with Shockley, he's getting a lot of contracts. He also did a lot of work in World War II. And they're really interested in this idea of gathering intelligence. So intelligence has a very special meaning in the military context, in the surveillance context. And I think we still see that now today. And in particular in this story, this idea of this data-driven, godlike tool, I think has some real resonance for the moment that we're living in right now with generative AI. So all of those things, we can trace all of these ingredients that we have right now for modern AI and ML. I'm going to use those terms a bit interchangeably today. The data, the algorithms, the compute, all of those things we can trace back to this 1950s effort. So if we think about machine learning in kind of simple terms, non-technical terms, it's really about finding patterns in data. And we can think about this moment that we're living in right now as kind of the next chapter in this bigger story. So this story is about big data, it's about analytics. That story's been going on for about 20 years now. Everybody's been really excited about getting all of the information out of their data. And now we're also excited about automation. And automation, again, has a long history, but now the things that we can automate with these AI systems are just growing and being applied to more of the knowledge work. And that's causing us to think about things a little bit differently when it comes to ethics. I just want to touch on what are we automating anyways, because we use this term AI like everybody knows exactly what it is, when really it's kind of this umbrella term for a whole bunch of different technologies. And the reason I bring this up, and I know that you know this because you work in this field, you do research in this field, but the reason this is important is because when we start to look at the ethics and how we're going to address all these ethical issues, we need to know what we're dealing with. It's not just a monolith. And so these are some of the things that we're automating with AI. And these are some of the ways in which it connects to some ethical issues. So if we think about decision support systems, for example, we're using them to make decisions that have really important consequences for people. Who's going to get health care? Who's going to get a loan? Who's going to get a job? These are really important questions that impact people's lives. And then we can think about these new generative AI technologies. What do they mean for things like education? They're really going to change the way that we do things. So there's a whole bunch of ethical questions there. We can think about simple things like just translating. How does that have ethical issues? Well, things like gender bias come up in that. We can think about social media, misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes. How do we know what's true anymore? And what does that mean for things like democracy? And then we can think about classification systems. What happens when the classifier doesn't recognize the dog? What happens when someone is misrecognized or misidentified and that person gets arrested? Lots of ethical questions there. And then, of course, there's this idea of humans being mediated by these platforms. We're just another input in this whole system. And again, there's a lot of ethical issues related to that. I want to roll this all up one higher level and talk a bit about some of the core issues that we see in the field of AI ethics. So privacy is a huge concern. People are concerned about the data. Do we have the consent to use that data? Over surveillance, all of these things tend to come up a lot. And then there's this issue of fairness. How do we know that bias and discrimination isn't happening? How do we know that justice is being served when these AI systems make decisions about people? Transparency is another issue, and this relates to this idea of we need to know if something came from an AI system. So whether that's a piece of content or whether we're chatting with a chatbot and we think we're chatting with a human, there's this whole issue of deception that can happen if we're not transparent. And somewhat related to that is explainability, and I believe the next speaker is going to be talking about explainability quite a bit. And why this is really important is that if we don't understand how these systems work, it really starts to impact our agency and autonomy, because we have the ability to make good decisions about our lives, but if we don't know how things work, how can we make good choices about our lives? So having explainable systems is an important piece of this as well. And then finally, this idea of accountability. Who is accountable at the end of the day if an AI system makes a decision about you? Say, you're not going to get that job. Who do you go to redress that issue, to contest that issue? Who is going to be responsible? So these are some of the big ethical issues, not all of them, but some of the big ones that come up in this field. I want to also try and categorize some of these things in a few buckets tonight. And I'm mostly going to spend time on the design piece because that's where your work is really involved in making design choices. But I do want to touch very lightly on the other two issues, or the other two groupings that I see, that of control and that of use. So one of the big things that we talk a lot about in this field is power dynamics. Who has power? Who has control? And what we see, and I would say especially with compute, and I find it interesting because here we are at the Cloud Computing Conference talking about the ways in which compute can enable things, but we should also be thinking about who owns these systems. And literally, we can probably name on one hand the big players in this field. So there's a consolidation of power here that's happening, and we're seeing it more and more, especially as these larger language models come into play. There's only a handful of companies in the world that are really well equipped to do this. So we're not going to touch on this issue too much more tonight, but I just wanted to point that out. And then there's this idea of where we use machine learning. And this is a quote from the FAIR ML book, which is a free online resource and talks about fair machine learning practices. It's a great resource if you're interested in this kind of work. And it talks about this idea that when the past looks like the future, machine learning works pretty well. And that sort of makes sense. We're using data from the past to predict the future. But when things are dynamic, when things are in flux, when there's a lot of change, the past doesn't look like the future, then maybe machine learning is not the right tool in those situations. And one of my concerns is when people are involved, lots of things can happen. There's a lot of dynamic things that happen. And when we use machine learning in really high stakes areas like law enforcement, social services, these are highly dynamic areas. Maybe it doesn't work as well as we think it does, and maybe we shouldn't be using it there. So that's a little bit on the use. Again, I'm not going to spend too much more time on that tonight. What I really want to talk about is the design choices that we make. And in a lot of cases, I think we make some pretty poor choices. So that's the bad news. The good news, though, is I think we can make better ones. So let's talk a bit about some of those design choices. And I first want to spend a little bit of time talking about data. And I think that as someone who comes from the social sciences and the humanities, I tend to think about data a little bit differently than you do. But I'm going to start here with the data lifecycle. So this is something you probably are fairly familiar with. You can think about the ways in which we collect data, use data, store data, all the way through to how we dispose of data. But what I've done is I've mapped some of the ethical issues against the lifecycle. And I'm not going to go into all of these tonight, but the main point here is that there is ethics throughout the data lifecycle. So sometimes I think people think, oh, well, we'll do the ethics review at the front or at the end, and then we'll be okay. But really, there's a lot of ethical choices that go into the work itself. And so that's why it's really important to think about ethics all the way through the data lifecycle. So when we think about data itself, in our culture, in our Western culture, we tend to think of data as the truth. We say things like, we're going to be data-driven, we're going to be evidence-based, we're going to get to the cold, hard facts with our data. And yet, data is always an imperfect representation. So you might have heard the saying, the map is not the territory. And it gets at this idea that we're always representing something with our data, and it's never really perfect. Even if we're building a digital twin, we're always picking and choosing what are the features we're going to represent. And so we have these two ideas that are a bit in tension. Data is truth, we're going to be data-driven. Data is kind of imperfect, it's a representation. So there's a tension between these perspectives about data. Data can also contain bias, and there's lots of different ways this can happen. I'm just going to point out a few of them tonight. I like showing this these two data sets just to kind of illustrate this point of historical bias. So one data set is a small data set. So Prime Ministers of Canada, we can look at it at a glance, we can see who is in this data set. And what we see is that it's mostly men. There's only one woman in this data set. Everybody is white in this data set. And if we were to look at the socioeconomic background of who's been Prime Minister of Canada, we see a certain class of person. So imagine if we take that data set, that's all our model knows, just the data that we fed it, and we say, tell us who is going to be a great leader. And we use a really historically biased data set like this, we're going to get some biased results. And that's somewhat what we're doing. But the data looks like the second data set. This is 80 million tiny images. It's a data set that was put out in the world by MIT, lived in the world for a very long time, spawned other data sets like CFAR 10, CFAR 100, is cited in lots of papers. And it was only after some researchers really started digging into this that they found some really racist and sexist imagery, so much so that they stopped using this particular data set. So this is a challenge. We have massive amounts of data. We don't always know what's in our data. And what's happening now, and this is from some work that was done with Midjourney, is that we amplify these stereotypes. And we can create more new data that is based on these stereotypes. So in this particular study, they prompted Midjourney with an Indian person. Somewhere in the data set, there was some stereotypical version of an older man in a turban, prompts new data. Now, if you know anything about the country of India, you know it's actually a fairly young country. This is not really representative of an Indian person. And yet this is what was in that data set, gets amplified, and now we're producing all of this new data based on these stereotypes. We can also think about the proxies that we use to measure hard to capture ideas. Not everything is as easy as taking a measuring tape and just measuring something. So if we think about something like criminality, for example, how are we going to measure criminality? Well, we might say, let's look at some arrest data, let's look at some conviction data. But what if, for the arrest data, we were sending our police force into the same neighborhood over and over again, and they were there, and so they made some arrests, and all of a sudden our arrest data is higher for that particular neighborhood? Or what if somebody hires a team of fancy lawyers, and even though there's a lot of evidence to suggest they might be guilty of a particular crime, their fancy team of lawyers manages to ensure that they are not convicted of that crime? So that's happened. Conversely, if you can't hire those fancy lawyers, maybe you get convicted of crime at a higher rate. So these are ways in which our data can be inaccurate, and that it's also just a proxy for this bigger idea that we were trying to measure, which is criminality. We can also think about bias from instruments, and this is really important because we're censoring up the world with all kinds of things, gathering data all the time, and yet these sensors don't work the same for everyone. So this is a pulse oximeter, measures the blood oxygen level, doesn't work as well for people with darker skin. This is the realm of facial recognition technologies as well. They've been shown not to work as well for people with darker skin. And so this is a really important point to know about your data, because if you think it's all just working the same for everyone, you're missing this sort of bias. There's also missing data, and this seems a little paradoxical because I've been saying we have all this big data, we have so much data, and yet there's certain groups of people that we don't have enough data about. So there's a book called Invisible Women, talks about the lack of data for women in really important contexts like healthcare, clinical trials. We test a drug on a male population, yet we release it to everyone. And so what we do when we do that is we erase the experiences of people. If we don't have data about them, they're not included in our analysis, and that's another form of bias. We can also think about the environmental impacts, and as we're dealing with climate change, the environment is really a concern that we should all be thinking about. And data, it lives in the cloud. That sounds really nice, but what is the cloud? It's a bunch of data centers around the world, and those data centers need to be heated and cooled. There is a materiality about all of this. And so we need to really be thinking about that. And there's some new work coming out right now that's kind of showing the illustration of when we start using these large language models, for example, generative AI versus a regular Google search, just how much more energy we're using, just how carbon intensive some of these systems are. And then we can think about the ways in which our data is not just about us. And I think one of the best stories that illustrates that is what happened with the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. So it wasn't just about the people who took that personality quiz. It was all their friends, all their family, all that data was implicated. We can also think about DNA and 23andMe, Ancestry.com. Now, in this case, some relative of the Golden State Killer donated a sample of DNA, and they were able to catch a killer, and you might think, that's fantastic, how wonderful. But imagine if it was something else. Imagine if it was something like your cousin goes and does a 23andMe test, and now you and your kids can't get health care because they've exposed some kind of medical issue in the family line. So it can go both ways as well. So the point here is that we're all entangled in this. It's not just necessarily about your data, it's about your data in relationship to others. So that's a lot about how data is used as an input. Data also plays this other role. It determines the problem formulation and algorithmic choices. And I kind of think about this like thinking about making a meal, and you want to make like this fantastic Italian dinner, and you go to your fridge and you open it up, and inside you've got like half a head of lettuce and some carrots and tomatoes, and you realize, I'm not making that Italian dinner that I envisioned. And I think this happens all the time in companies. I'm going to take this into more of a company example. And I blogged about this. I'm not going to give you all the details. If you're interested, you can go and read about it on my blog. But essentially what happened in this case is the company was tasked with finding the good leads that they would give to these auto dealers. So the auto dealers wanted to be able to sell cars to people, close deals, but this company had to give them the good leads. And in this story, they had to define in a data science and machine learning way, what exactly are good leads? How are we going to know how to find those good leads? And what happened was this whole chain of proxies where they defined it one way based on the data that they had. They needed other data. They couldn't get it. There were privacy issues. And it just went down this really interesting pathway, negotiating how to get the data. And I think this kind of thing happens all the time in companies. Getting the data to do the work really can drive the work that you're able to do. So if I have to sum up this data chapter, I think there is kind of a tug-of-war going on here. And on the one side, there's this idea that there's no data like more data. And if I mine it, it is mine. I'm just going to take that data. I'm going to use it. I need it for my large language models, generative AI, so forth. And on the other hand, there is this idea of fair information practices, things like necessity, proportionality, data minimization. All of these principles underpin a lot of our privacy laws and the ways that we think about using data in fair ways. And this idea of respect for people is really central to that. So getting consent and getting agreement. But I think there's a tension and a tug of war going on right now between these two ideas. Which brings me to ChatGPT and generative AI. So I'm going to bring these ideas about data together and just do a little bit of a critique on this particular technology. So I think ChatGPT and generative AI has a blood diamond problem. So Blood Diamond was a movie, came out in 2006, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, and it talked about the really unethical ways that diamond mining takes place. And it was a moment in the Western world when we realized that these shiny things that we wear on our hands, they weren't so shiny anymore. There was a lot of things that went into these diamonds that we really, didn't like and wanted to change. And I think ChatGPT and generative AI suffers from the same set of problems. So what I see is that we've taken the data. And who's being harmed by that? Well, artists are being harmed, illustrators, writers. There's lots of lawsuits happening right now. There's questions about what is in that data set. Again, going back to that issue of bias in the big data sets. We know there's things in there that are kind of harmful, but we're going to use them anyways. And then there's the carbon footprint, all the environmental issues as we build these models larger and larger. And we also ship a lot of the data processing work off to other countries. So whether that's reinforcement learning with human feedback, content moderation, data labeling, all of these other countries are involved in doing that work. People are subjected to a lot of trauma. They're not paid very well. So there's this whole supply chain issue as well in getting the data ready. So all of these ethical issues happen before you even get the product. It's not even on your desk yet. And these are all kind of entangled in the way it's made. And I think a big piece of this is normalizing this practice of web scraping. So this is something that I saw when I was doing my own research and talking to a lot of AI researchers. It's become very normal to just take data from the internet. And so this, I think, is a site that we're going to have to really grapple with, both legally and ethically. The other piece of the ChatGPT generative AI issue relates to a use case problem. And I'm calling this the other alignment problem. So this isn't the alignment problem about rogue AI. You might have heard of that alignment problem. This is the alignment problem of what we want from a technology and what the technology is actually good at delivering. So I kind of think of this like we invented a butter knife, but we really want to use it like a screwdriver. And that creates a whole bunch of other ethical issues. I think this headline from The Onion, it's a satirical publication, kind of sums it up really well. So ChatGPT forced to take the bar exam, even though its dream was to be an AI art bot. And so we create the hallucination problem. If it just is writing haiku and making up stories and doing art, there's no hallucination problem. There's no need for veracity or truthfulness there. The hallucination problem becomes real because we want this tool to do actual work that we're going to rely on. And that really is tied to a set of economic forces. So there's a lot of business interest in these tools to automate aspects of work, maybe automate whole jobs, mimic human behavior, create things like replica, for example, new kinds of companies, and all of that starts to then lead into these other ethical questions. And so this is sociotechnical because it's not just about the technology. The technology can generate a lot of things. The fact that we want them to be truthful, that involves our expectations. And so just to kind of sum that up, we got the design problems and we've got the use case problems when it comes to a technology like ChatGPT or generative AI. So what do we do about that? I think we can draw some clues from how we address the blood diamond problem. And what we did in that case is we said to people who mined diamonds, you got to do better. We need better options. We need better choices. So please fix this. And that's what I think is going to happen with these large language models. So this is a report from out of Stanford. It's the Foundation Model Transparency Index. And it's scoring these models on a bunch of different parameters. And so none of them score particularly well, but at least it's a baseline now to start analyzing what's gone into these models and how we can actually move forward and do better. So it's kind of an early indicator for moving forward. I also want to touch on this idea of designing for algorithmic fairness. So this is the whole algorithmic bias fairness question. And I think that this is an area which obviously has a lot of impacts on people's lives, and it's a really hard area to address for you as a designer. And part of the reason it's hard is that when we think about fairness in our world, and I would argue that we care about bias because we actually care about fairness, that's really what we want, the idea of what is fair changes all the time. And there's lots of different definitions for what is fair. So just to unpack this cartoon a little bit, we might say that fairness is about equality. Everybody gets the same thing. Everybody gets one box. Everybody gets one vote. Very fair. Or we might say it's about equity. It's about driving an outcome so that there's kind of an equitable piece for the outcome. So if someone doesn't need a box, well, we don't give them one. Someone needs two boxes. Somebody needs something else other than a box. And those are two very different things, but they're actually they're definitions of fairness that we use all the time. And so how do we deal with that algorithmically? And that's really what makes these kinds of things really challenging. So Compass was a big case in my world, in the world of AI ethics. It is an AI system that's used in recidivism, so parole, judging who's going to get given parole. And there was a big story that came out in 2016 by a team of investigative reporters in the US called ProPublica. And they got a hold of part of this data set that was being used to build this technology. And what they found when they did their analysis is that Black people were twice as likely to be misclassified as high risk and more likely to reoffend than white people. So the headline of this story was basically racist AI system. And Northpoint, the company who makes this system, they're now called Equivant, which I think speaks to this whole idea of what happens when your name gets dragged through the mud on one of these high-profile issues. They basically said, look, we don't even use race. That's not one of the things we look at. We're trying to be very fair. We think that there are good reasons to put people into different categories, but once they're in a category, we treat everybody the same. So if we're 5% wrong about you, we're 5% wrong about you as well. So we're trying to be really equal. And then this went back and forth in the media, and then another group of researchers came along and they did the math on all of this. And what they found is that these ideas are mathematically incompatible. So there was no way to reconcile these sets of ideas. Incidentally, and this is kind of another socio-technical piece to it, judges were also misusing the tool because they didn't have appropriate training. So there's a whole bunch of different pieces to this story. Arvind Narayanan is a professor who's done a lot of work on this idea of fairness. He has a great video called 21 Definitions of Fairness. And that's not because there's only 21, there's way more than that, but he had to cap it at 21. But he talks about this idea of stakeholders. And so if you think about a parole system, let's say that your job is to keep the worst offenders off the street. What side of this equation are you going to err on? Maybe you're thinking, well, you know, if I misclassified some people, but at least I'm doing my job. I'm keeping the worst offenders off the street. But if you're the person who's up for parole, you want to make sure you're not misclassified into that high-risk group. You have a whole different set of motivations. And so this is why it's really important to do the stakeholder work and really understand who are all the stakeholders, and then you're going to be able to make some trade-offs. And you need to make those trade-offs based on some moral grounds. It can't just be a random trade-off. There has to be some ethical reasons that you're going to stand by, that your organization is going to stand by. And that's why this work really needs to be done by an ethics committee. So it needs to be done by people who are trained in making these trade-offs. That can involve technologists, but it shouldn't just be the technologists. And that's where we need to, A, recognize the issue and then move it over to a committee to make the decision. And ultimately, organizations need to be transparent. They need to tell you how the decision was made, and they're going to need to also be accountable and own those decisions. And that's why it's really important that that work is done by a group of people. All right, so I'm going to end this on the more positive note of how can we do better. I definitely think we can do better. Wouldn't be here if I didn't. Ethical principles and hard lines are a good starting place. So when I work with organizations, I try and ask them to think about what are the hard lines? What are the things you will never do? The lines you will not cross. Those are your hard lines. And then your ethical principles. They shouldn't just be an off-the-shelf, I'll just take what Microsoft did and I'm going to apply those to my world. That's a good starting point. You can be inspired by that. But what you need to do is you need to get really specific, because it's not enough to say, let's be fair, let's be responsible, let's be transparent. Those are all good things, of course. But what exactly do we mean by that in this use case, in this particular model? So we need to get specific. And then we need governance mechanisms as well. So the ethics committee is one of them. But tone at the top of an organization is so important. So you have to have that executive sponsor who's on board with these ideas. It's very hard to push this rock up a hill. Of course, it can't stay just at the top. I think it needs to permeate through the organization. And it's not just for technical people in terms of training on ethics. It's also training for the non-technical people to understand a little bit more about how AI systems work and to participate in these conversations as well. So I think it's training for everyone. On that note, I have an offer for you if you're interested in training. I'm giving away one of my training courses. So if you're interested in that, I'm actually going to send this to Vanya as well, and then you can send it out to anyone. And it's an enter to win kind of a situation. So I'm just going to, I'll play a short video from one of the courses. This one is on data ethics. Maybe I won't play a short video because it's actually not loading up. I'll skip it. That's okay. So basically what we need to get to is this moment of data done right. And that's really thinking about all of the things that we've been talking about in terms of data, how we can treat data with the respect that it deserves, especially when it's attached to people. And there are some ethics tools that are available to do that as well. I always like to say these are not the ethics tools. It's not about rusty pliers, but I like this idea of tools and toolkits. The kinds of tools that are out there are things like monitoring your models, making sure they're not drifting, things to help you assess the bias in your data set, tools to help you think through the purpose, for example. Is it ethical from the start? How are you going about things? So there's lots of different tools out there. I actually have a toolkit on my website where I've reviewed 10 different tools. It's a free download if you're interested in taking a look at that. And ultimately, what we're trying to get to is building a responsible AI culture. So that involves you as a person, your organization, or the group that you're working with, and then ultimately as society. That's where we need to get to. All right, so that is the talk tonight. There's more about the work that I do on my website if you're interested, or you can learn more about the AI ethics microcredential. I don't know if we have time for questions or not, if there are any. Yeah, okay. All right, so yeah, I'm happy to take some questions if there's time, or if there are questions that you have. Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the common problems that you face when working with companies? Where do they usually lack when it comes to ethics?
One of the big problems right now is everyone thinks AI is magic, and they think it can do everything, and they just want it everywhere for everything. They're not even sure why they want it, they just believe they should have it. And so that's a really big problem because when people are trying to have reasonable conversations about data and all of these other things that we need to have in place, it's hard to compete with the conversation about magic. So I think trying to educate people and temper their expectations and help them find appropriate use cases, I think is a big piece of the work that needs to happen. Great question. Yeah.
Do you find that people just hide behind AI to justify kind of terrible business decisions? That they say, oh, there's an AI, oh, it just did it, but not the fact that whatever you were doing before, that they hit the AI as well.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, I don't know that they do that all the time in a nefarious way. I think sometimes what happens is automation bias sets in. So there's a sense that computers can do things better than us. And they can in some cases. They actually can do certain things better than us. Like remember phone numbers. Like who knows a phone number anymore? We just outsource that to our technology. And I think what happens is we just start relying on it more and more, and then we come to not question it at all. And that's part of it. So I think you're right, but I don't know if it's always like done with kind of ill intentions. I think sometimes it's just a sense that, well, we're fallible humans, and so the machine must know better. When really we really should question some of these things a little bit more than we do. Yeah.
So you were talking about the stereotypes and how they affect. I have this in my research, but the data that I used is different from the data that you were talking about. So a system was generating data in my case. How do we know if that's a stereotype or that's like a new behavior of the system? That's it's generating a new pattern that you should watch. How do you know if this is like a stereotype, like anomaly, or that's a new behavior that you haven't had in your historical data? It just arose.
So you've got your data, you put it into your system, and you're thinking that there's new data being generated or a new. I'm not sure if I understand.
So you were talking about stereotypes.
Oh, stereotypes. Okay, yeah.
There's something that is different. You wanted to have more data to kind of include that. For example, Black people.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you, so in the case of a system that you don't know about it, like it's not the people, it's just numbers. How do you know that a thing is a stereotype or anomaly, or it's a new behavior of the system? It's generated and it's right, it's true. How do you know it's a...
Yeah, it's super tricky. I think that's where the value of getting other stakeholders involved can help. Because sometimes you personally might not know, but if you went out and said, okay, so I want to use this new data that was generated by an AI system and it's of, X people, is that okay? Like, here's a data set, is that okay? Or do you have some thoughts on that? Like, I think that's one way to kind of address it, is to get feedback from other people to kind of give you a sense of like, maybe that is a stereotype and maybe it's better not to like use that as your, to augment your data set to the next level because it's actually reinforcing a stereotype. Sometimes it's not obvious to see. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much.